Is mechanical versus electronic the hottest trailhead tech chat? Oh, I'm not talking about EMTB versus MTB. We've got a whole channel for that chat. We're talking transmission, or is that drivetrain? Wired versus wireless. We're going to tell you everything they're not telling you. I've got two bikes behind me. I've got an Orbea Rallon, which is equipped with the Shimano's XT mechanical group set. And I've got a Canyon Neuron equipped with SRAM's GX AXS Transmission. To be very clear, this isn't a test. Both these group sets are very good, and they offer a range of differences in terms of crank length and chainring size. And you've got big cassettes on both of them, so there's lots of similarities between them. But there's a big difference between mechanical systems and electronic. So that's what we're going to focus on, what we're going to explore here. And of course, we should say that they're in a similar space in the ranges from both SRAM and Shimano, so it's good to compare the pros and cons of each. And of course, we're talking about SRAM and Shimano, but there's other brands creating really good drivetrains too. TRP, for example, and MicroShift, and newer to Western worlds, you've got LTWOO and you've got WheelTop, both making electronic and mechanical group sets. But it's easy, and I would say fair to say, that SRAM and Shimano are the shifting titans. So let's explore what the differences are between mechanical shifting and electronic. With anything new, and especially anything new and electronic, especially on mountain bike, people are going to ask, how much is it? Well, we can break down the price. For this GX AXS T-type transmission, we get the rear mech, the chain, the cassette, the crankset, sometimes you get BB but you have to check, and the shifter pod for £1,180. That's at retail, and that's what we're going to compare because it's easier to compare more fairly. You can get a older GX AXS rear shifter and pod as an upgrade kit, so no chain, no cassette, none of the other parts essentially, and it's also the older type, so it's not mounted like this one is. And you can get that for around $550, so there is a cheaper electronic option. Now on to mechanical. We're looking at Shimano XT, just like this. So in a group set, we haven't quite got a full group set here, but for shifting purposes, it will work very, very similar. So we've got a crankset, that's available in different ranges. You've got the chainring, you've got the cassette, you've got the chain, the rear mech, and the shifter. And you can get all of that for £610. Yes, that's £570 cheaper. So there is clearly a price difference between electronic and mechanical. Both brands offer a range of different group sets and transmissions at different price points. But if you're really keen, you can get seriously spendy. How spendy? Well, SRAM does its XX SL AXS T-type transmission with a power meter for £2,890. Yeah, that's spendy. Or you could go for Shimano's mechanical system, their XTR, which is their top of the line, well, mechanical group set, for £1,125. But the choice is yours. The weight of mountain bikes, well, it does matter. Okay, we've moved on from the hyper weight conscious mid-90s where products are actually ranked on weight more than actually how they functioned. But that said, weight still matters. So what is the weight of these different group sets? Because there is a difference. Batteries versus cables. The SRAM GX AXS transmission weighs in at 2,015 grams. The Shimano XT mechanical group set weighs 1,804 grams. So it's about 210 grams difference. That probably doesn't mean much to many people, but depending on the size of your gummy bears, it's around 70 individual gummy bears. How easy are they to set up? Well, let's dive into the workshop and find out. How easy are they to set up? Well, a lot of this will depend on your experience, and my experience is, well, decades worth of setting up cable pull derailleurs, be those rear mechs or even front mechs as well, if you remember those. So for me, setting up a rear mech, you've got to set your B tension, you've got to adjust your limit screws, you've got to make sure the chain's the right length, and then you've got to do cable tensioning as well. But for me, all of that process is really quite intuitive. It's quite simple because just working through the steps and it's all there in front of you. If you kind of turn one limit screw or you turn a B tension, you can see it adjusting. Okay, moving to the AXS T-type transmission system. Okay, for me, with my decades of cable experience, this mech was different to fit. Different doesn't necessarily mean difficult because, well, there isn't a B tension adjuster, there isn't the limit screws to adjust, and, well, there's no cable tension to adjust either. You just have to make sure that the chain is the right length, and there is an app for that, where you just put in your model and size, because it's chainstay specific, and then it tells you what chain length to run, and then that tells you what chain tension to run as well. So it is very simple in terms of you go through the steps that SRAM's got on its app and you can set it up. For me, it's kind of counterintuitive because, well, I like setting these limit screws. I know what they are. But for lots of people, well, do we really need them? Well, SRAM thinks that you don't. So in terms of setup, I guess it's where your experience comes from. But they're both pretty simple and both have got really good guidance onto how you set them up. So opposed to playing with cable tension, you can play with the app with the SRAM system, which not only means you can flip what the buttons do, when, but you can also get loads of data from it in terms of what gears you're in and how often you shifted, which can be interesting if that's your thing. Okay, we briefly need to chat about cable routing. Especially on frame designs, it's changed a lot. I think that for really good bikes, at least early on, it was a defining thing to have good cable routing. And it was something that you didn't notice until you got on a bike where you did notice it. And I think some of the early suspension bikes were quite guilty of bad cable routing. Some of them ghost shifted. So as the suspension moved through its travel, well, you'd change gear, which, as you can imagine, wasn't ideal. As suspension designs have kind of lent into consumer demand for clean cockpits, we've got lots of internal cable routing versus external cable routing. There's lots of different options. I've chatted with lots of different riders. Some that really like a clean cockpit, they like the internal cable routing. Conversely, I've chatted to mechanics that really don't like it, but there's options out there. Obviously, wireless by its very name is without wires, so it's one less set of cables that you have to plumb through the frame. So it is an option to consider. What about maintenance? Well, let's head back to the workshop and find out. Here we are in the workshop, a great place to do maintenance. And we need to talk about maintenance because, well, lots of drivetrains, whether they'll be electronic or mechanical, are gonna have wear on them, specifically the chain. So with either group set, you're gonna have to use a chain checker, and using it regularly will mean that you can monitor how the chain, and thus how the chain rings and how the cassette all wears, because those are all wear items. It can get spendy if you don't replace that chain. Okay, what other things can go wrong? Well, we'll start with the Shimano system. And the Shimano system is really good. It is very robust. They've been making drivetrains for a long time. It does have a cable, and that's the thing we need to talk about. Depending on that cable routing, which you sort of chatted on and touched on earlier, if the routing is quite clean and you're riding in dry conditions, well, actually, your shifting could last for ages before it needs any maintenance. But it will be a finite amount of time because, well, even with the best cable routing, but if you've got sort of a mess of spaghetti as your cable routing, then you'll need it happen sooner. The cable, it wears. So that cable will stretch a little bit, the housing will compress as well, and sometimes if using the nice cables, the ultra low friction stuff that has a liner inside, well, depending on the curve and radius of those kind of curves that the cable takes on, well, that will wear. If you ride in really muddy conditions and really wet conditions, and you're not that great at jet washing your bike and you're a bit haphazard and you're a bit rough with where you spray, then you are realistically going to contaminate these cables. Best case, you might be able to get away with just replacing the inner, so that's just the actual metal bit of cable. But realistically, at some point you're going to have to replace the outer. And again, back to that cable routing, if it's nice and clean and really simple, like it is on this bike, well, it's not too much bother. If it's a more convoluted system, well, it might be more engaging, it might take you longer. The electronic drivetrain is almost maintenance free. Okay, after the chain, cassette, all the normal stuff that's going to wear. Because yeah, the battery has got about 20 hours of life, but that 20 hours is actual riding time. So unless you're doing 24-hour racing, it's really easy to go for lots of rides and forget when you last charged it up. This is the battery that's on the rear derailleur. The battery at the pod should last for around 2 years of use. It's just a watch battery, so it's not rechargeable, you just have to replace it. So it is a little bit annoying, and I guess we should factor that is part of the maintenance, is changing the batteries. So yeah, not completely maintenance free, but very low maintenance. For a long time, derailleurs or rear mechs have been mounted on, well, a pretty much standard design. Now, I say standard because there was huge, absolutely wild variation in designs from frame to frame for a long, long time. But essentially both SRAM and Shimano use the same threaded mounting style, and it was pretty good. Those replaceable mech hangers were really well designed, not because they're all different, no, that was really confusing and annoying, but the fact that you had a part that would break if something hit your rear mech. That was useful, assuming you'd packed a spare in your camelback. Okay, designs developed, and we had from SRAM the UDH, which was a unified universal derailleur hanger. UDH. It was really good, it fitted loads of different frames. UDH was more than just a derailleur or mech hanger standard. It was a frame standard too, and that was important because there was a new rear mech standard, this T-type or T-type transmission. And the way it mounts is very, very different. We don't have a mech hanger. It uses the UDH frame standards, and those are really important because they have a really tight tolerance for the axle, which means we know where the cassette is, and for where the rear mech is. And that tightness of tolerance means that, well, SRAM can get rid of all the things that you might have on a normal rear mech. So there aren't any limit screws, there's no B tension, because that interface and its stiffness and tolerance is really high. So what are the pros? Well, there is that stiffness under shift. You can shift under load because this interface is so good. You've also got rid of that dangly bit that you might bend, the mech hanger. Okay, what are the cons of this system? Well, I guess the cons are you've got rid of that dangly bit that the mech hanger swings off, because whilst it could bend and go out of alignment, it was also useful if you whacked your mech hard enough that you could damage the mech. Well, with a UDH or similar mech hangers, that would bend, not the rear mech. SRAM does say that these mechs are really tough, and lots of social media of pro racers and pro riders from SRAM standing on their rear mechs would obviously prove that. But it does mean that some parts are going to be replaceable and have to be replaceable on these T-type mechs because, well, if you whack something hard enough, you could damage it. I'm going to dive into a massive dialogue now about how they feel. Lots of nuances about the different shifting feel. But before I say that, I'm going to say something that pretty much no other tester is going to say, and that's that I'm really biased. Yeah, I'm saying it. Loud and proud, I am biased. I'm biased because I've used lots of different shifting systems in the past. I've used Shimano, I've used SRAM, I've used Sachs, I've used MicroShift, I've used Campanolo. Yes, I've used a lot of different systems. And that means that I'm already sort of preloaded to how a shifter might work. And it's not without trying, but you've got to remember, I'm a much older rider than I look. I've ridden lots of systems. The early systems, well, the chain would kind of jump around and get jammed. We were shifting on triples, and we had to be really careful with how we did shift. We had to time it correctly. We also had to lift off the power, shift, wait a little while all the cogs and cassette and chain all engaged, and then you could get back on the power. And that way of shifting has just been burnt into my brain. So however much I try and shift under load and under power, like these systems say that they can, I just can't. And then the other thing is, well, yeah, let's take a look at them. Let's take a look at these not very big legs. I am not a massive sprinter. I am not a powerhouse with huge amounts of watts to pour into the pedals. So that is also a factor. You will be different, no doubt. You may have the subtlety of an elephant on a unicycle. When you shift, you just click that shifter and hope it goes in. Also, you might be bestowed with huge legs and huge amounts of watts. I'm not, so I am biased in the way that I think about these shifters. T-type transmission. Well, I didn't think it would feel as different as it does because essentially it's just a 12-speed, 1x system, but it does feel really different. Some of that is, well, the feedback from the shifter. You haven't got the pulling and pushing feeling that you're moving something inside. It is just a push button. It's like just tapping a key code. And some of that kind of lack of sort of tactileness means that it does shift differently. I think what is really impressive, even though my brain still tells me to ease up when I'm shifting, you could just shift under full power. It is really impressive. The speed is different. It's not quite as quick and it is just single shift. I think if I got my phone out, I could dive onto the app and change and play around with, well, how the buttons work and how quickly they shift a little bit. So I think that customization is really impressive. And whilst for me, I quite like that feedback of pushing something, on a longer ride, if I was going for miles and miles, or I'd got like a slightly dicky thumb, the advantage of being able to place the shifter pretty much exactly where I want to. I'm not tethered. I'm not wired into any location. I can put that shifter pod anywhere I like. And because I'm just pushing a button, the load is really low, so you don't have to have loads of hand strength. So again, if you're doing big days out in the mountains when you've got sore hands, well, that could be an advantage. The Shimano system feels very, very natural. It feels intuitive, but I've been shifting with Shimano products since 1996. I'm older than I look. And well, there's that wonderful feedback loop that you get from actually pushing a lever and it pulling on something and moving something inside the shifter, which then moves something inside the outer cable, which then moves that cable around. And that feedback is really nice. If I pedal smoothly and I'm not kind of hammering away, I can dump down the gears and jump up them. So the shift speed is really impressive. If I wasn't as subtle and being able to just lift off the power, I think maybe you could make a mess of that cassette. But for me, that feedback loop is really nice. Okay, I am still pushing that lever. So if the kind of cable gets mangled and there's a bit of crud in the system, then over time, yeah, I'm gonna have to use my thumb more, and it will take a little bit longer to push. But the shift speed is really impressive. So which is the king or queen of the 12-speed? Amazing shifting. Well, actually, I don't think one usurps the other. I think whilst they're very different systems and they do ride differently and they do feel different on the trail, I don't think one's necessarily better than the other. There's pros and cons for them both, which I know is a bit wishy-washy, but think of it like this. When you were a kid, and when I was a kid, if you thought that wireless technology would come to mountain biking where you'd just be able to press button and move all the way through your cassette, I just would have said you're mad. And that's, yeah, what, 25, 35 years ago? Okay, the Shimano system is much lower key. It's subtler, it's smoother, but there's that wonderful feedback. Which one is better? Well, I think that's down to what you want from your shifting. They're both very good. Hopefully the wired and wireless wanderings have helped you decide which one's better and which one, when you're having that debate at the trailhead, you can really go all in on because someone on the internet said that one's better than the other. Just to confirm, they're not. They're both really good group sets. I mean, maybe what would really settle the debate is if there was a Shimano wireless system or there was a mechanical T-type. But I mean, that's just the stuff of childhood dreams, isn't it? That'll never happen, ever, right? Well, hopefully you've enjoyed it. And if you have, give me the thumbs up and like it. And if you haven't already, do subscribe to the channel. It helps us make great content just like this.